right. How about that? Perfect. So welcome everybody to our workshop on, and we obviously have somebody who's made a call and struggling to get through, to our workshop on social enterprise development. If you want to ask a question or whatever, just put your hand up. In the meantime, I will introduce you to Kylie Hansen, who from founding director of Impact Seed and also Link West board member. And Kylie will tell you a little bit about herself.
Oh, now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Kylie. As Jane mentioned, I'm on the Link West board, but also have founded Impact Seed. So I'll talk a bit about Impact Seed later, but I guess in terms of the other work that I do, have mostly been engaged with, I guess, reform and strategic policy and project management related to the sector and government. So the interplay between, the delivering community services and partnership policy, for example, and how that affects the sector. I'm working on the outcomes measurement framework at the moment in partnership with WACOS and Department of Premier and Cabinet. So yeah, anything that kind of interfaces between the community services sector and government, that's often where I spend my time. But in addition to spending time around social enterprise and impact investment. So yeah.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So today's session, we're going to talk about, or Kylie's going to talk about profit and purpose, sorting through the concept. So it's a little bit, if you like, myth busting and a clarification around social enterprises and some of the terms, etc. In the email that we put out, we also said we'll have a discussion about these concepts and talk about impact investment and what social enterprise looks like in WA. And this will be followed up with a conversation about impact investment and social enterprise in place. Those two conversations will actually be the next two workshops, because we only have an hour today. So pretty much today is very much around the definitions of the basic concepts in the world of combining profit and purpose. But before we dive in, I thought it would be helpful if we could just go around the room, and if you would just like to let us know what your questions are, or what it was that interested you in this topic. As far as I'm concerned and Link West is concerned, we know that all of our members are under increasing pressure to diversify their incomes from whether they're a neighbourhood centre funded by communities or a CRC funded by DPIRD, increasing costs, threatening sustainability. And social enterprise is a word that we're hearing more and more bandied around at government, local government, not-for-profit level, and so it's really a bit of a clarification. So I'm on this learning journey with you. I'm looking forward to learning with Kylie. And so I'll just go from on the screen. I'll just go around. So. Kim at Corda, what was your reason for joining today, or question?
We already do a bit of work outside of what we're contracted to do, and I've paid a service. So I guess I hope I'm on the right track. A bit of clarity as to where the line for them stops and the line for the community starts, if you know what I mean. Because some things are community-based. Where does it fit in? How do we put that in our plan and our action plans? And how do we, draw the line between whether it's for them or for...
So when you say them, you mean for a part of your contract with DPIRD, or...
Well, no, because we've got a fee. We get paid to do services on behalf of other groups. So, can we include that? How does that fit into our action plan? Can it be included if we do things for the community? But yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, right. think I understand. Jo from Quairading.
Hi, yep, no, I'm just keen to hear from an expert the definition of social enterprise.
Okey-doke. Thank you, Jo. The next Jo from Brunswick Junction.
Hello, ladies. I've got Tina with me today as well, but I'll let her see what her thoughts are as well. So for me, I think I grasp the concept of social enterprise. It'll be interesting to see if that's the same as Kylie's. For us, I like to keep everything separate, so what we do for DFID happens over here. We've got a contract at the moment that we're paid to do a service, which is great. We're hoping the revenue for that will go back into our core objectives and fund the centre potentially beyond government funding altogether in the future. I don't think it'll fully fund everything that we do currently, so we need to look at other things that can potentially do that as well. So last year we even looked at a laundromat, and it's been something that we've thrown around for a long time now. So I think we still want to look at that. Maybe today's session will help us make a decision whether we still carry on looking at that or look at something else. So, but I'm interested to find out more.
Yeah, definitely. What we've already looked at research, we want to see whether that sort of fits with the social enterprise model. Yeah.
Great. And do you know that Northcliffe Family Centre do run a laundromat as a social enterprise?
No, we didn't. Thank you.
So it'd be worth talking to them to find out how that works for them.
Great, thank you.
No problem. So we've got Loretta at Gomalling.
That's exactly what I'm here for. You just gave a tip to another CRC. Basically, I'm being nosy to see who's doing what and when and how it's going. And yes, the whole concept of social enterprise. If there is a very, I think like Kim at Quarter, the lines. Are there any lines? Can they be blurred? Just yes, to be nosy and to see what everyone's doing and to maybe clarify. Yeah.
And that was one of my. That's where I'm on my learning journey. Is where does, as Kylie explained to me, social enterprising end, and it becomes a sort of a social enterprise as such. Because I think all of our member centres are social enterprising to a certain degree. So yeah, that's a great one. Susan from Boddington.
Oh, hi. I only started here in January, and so I'm not quite sure, I haven't had much to do this. So I'd say it's probably something that's moving innately, but I'm not sure of the definition and how it fits into the aspect of the contract. So, whether it's another contract or as an addition, I just sort of here to learn. Thanks.
Okay, that's great, thanks. And Mariana from Wagen? Can't hear.
Hi, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So we're basically just here to listen as well and sort of just grasp an idea about, social enterprise and basically how it will benefit the CRC and just basically, here to listen.
Okay. And John from Bridgetown?
Yes, good morning all. I guess I'm here just to hear what's being said about social enterprise. I've got some understanding of it, and like you, I believe a lot of what we already do is social enterprise. But I'm also concerned that, and I think CRCs particularly need to be a little bit concerned about where they push themselves to in terms of their responsibilities under the new Associations Act. Because once you push yourself into a Tier 2 group, there comes some very, very significant implications with that, particularly around funding, particularly around the accounting process that that will have to be implemented. And I think some of the CRCs are not aware of what those implications are. So I'd be interested to see if some of that comes out today.
Planned on touching on that,
but we can.
Yeah, that's great. Petra from Denmark. Thank you, John.
Yeah, good morning all, and it's a good point, John, because I hadn't thought of that either. But I'm also wondering always where this competition factor comes in. You know, like in the past we were told that we can't go in competition with any of our, or my understanding was we can't go in competition with local businesses, and so I'm constantly trying to think of something, how I can actually sustain the organization. I'm highly interested in finding out what comes of these conversations to hopefully find something that where we can actually get an additional income from it. And as everyone else, we do our own stuff. We, you know, like we are lucky that we have got a big room hire facility, which that makes us sort of 40,000 a year. That's a really great thing, and so was needed in the community. But you know, like I need more of those kind of projects if I ever want to seriously consider that I don't need the money from the government, which I would be loving not to have it, but yeah, so that's what I'm interested in. And in particular, the competition sector, and also the mixed information that goes out to the community, because somehow they always think things need to be free, and then if they have to pay for something, it's all of a sudden be hard to sell certain things. So yeah, so that's what I'm interested in.
Okay, yeah, all really good points. That's fascinating. And we've got, okay, and Caroline from Dongra, who I can't see, but apparently you're there.
Good morning, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm just interested in where the discussion was going this morning. We're all socially orientated businesses, and trying to be practical and effective, and stay in profit, which can be a little tad tricky sometimes. So I'm just interested in what everyone has to say.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everybody. It's some good questions and thought-provoking ideas there. And I will hand over to Kylie.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jane. And I think a lot of what you have spoken about, we will wind back to through some of the content of the presentation. But where we don't, definitely let's, you know, have the conversation towards the end. So what I've got here are a few slides, which I think we're sharing with you. But basically they will help us to flesh out some of the concepts. So just so we make sure we're all using the same language consistently, because it is definitely one of the challenges that we have with social enterprise and impact investment. And then, yeah, and then the idea is that we can have a conversation around those. I'm not stuck on whether we have to have the conversation at the end. So if you do have a question or clarification request throughout, feel free, like Jane said, to just put your hand up, or if I can't see you on the screen, just yell out, and we can, you know, have that conversation then. So this is just a little bit about Impact Seed, which is the organisation that I work with. So we are one of WA's only dedicated capacity builders for impact investment and social enterprise development. So we work very much in this space between traditional business, traditional startups, traditional investment, and philanthropy and grants. And this is why I try to refer to it a bit more as blurring the boundaries between profit and purpose, because social enterprise and impact investment are discrete concepts that have definitions globally and nationally. But I think some things that we do don't necessarily fit into one of those, you know, kind of definitions, and so we don't want to exclude that, because there's still interesting and innovative ways that we're combining profit and purpose in different ways. So that is what we're interested in at Impact Seed, even if it doesn't always fit the traditional definitions of social enterprise and impact investment. If it is blurring profit and purpose in different ways, then we're interested in how we can support that. And This slide shows, and you won't be able to read it, but we can make the slides available to you afterwards. This shows what the landscape of support and intermediaries looks like for this area in WA, but also interstate. So above the line, you've got Western Australia. We've got a fairly good philanthropy network, not as strong as those that we have in the eastern states. But we do have a number of foundations. We have Lottery West, which is a big game changer for WA compared to other states. And then on the right-hand side, all of those blue circles, that's all of the incubators, accelerators, intermediaries that work with startups. So traditional startups. In WA, we're very focused on tech and mining startups. They make up the bulk of the kind of startup scene that we have here in WA. But we've got quite a few, to say the least, particularly for, I guess, a smaller state. We've got quite a few. Those two areas, philanthropy and business and tech, are similarly quite diverse in the eastern states, but they've also got in the eastern states a much more diverse sort of support network for social enterprise and impact investment, which we just don't have here in WA. So we've had a few things happen over time. So the Centre for Social Impact has and still continues to run the Graduate Certificate in Social Impact. We've had the School for Social Entrepreneurs here, but unfortunately it left again. We have Social Ventures Australia here, but unfortunately in WA only do consulting rather than doing the impact investment work. So we just have kind of a bit of a dearth here. So where possible, Impact Seed is kind of filling that gap. It's not ideal. That is not for the purposes of good business strategy. That's not ideal. You wouldn't be trying to fill that sort of gap. But over time, hopefully, we hope we can bring more experts and expertise into the field, so we're not filling quite such a large gap. So now we'll go through an introduction to these concepts. So we're kind of throwing them around, and I think as some of you identified, you're kind of aware of some of them. You generally know what they are, but just making sure we're all on the same page. So, animations. I always forget that I put animations in, and then take forever. All right, so a social enterprise is an organisation that is led by an economic, social, cultural or environmental mission. And that is front and centre with a social enterprise. It also derives a substantial proportion of income from trade and reinvests the majority of the profit or the surplus in the mission. Now, the delineations around this vary based on who you're talking to, and it is important to note that social enterprise is still actually a really varied and contested concept internationally and nationally. We go by the definition which Joe Barrackett has put from CSI, but the other kind of, I guess, definitional things we use would be at least 50% of the income is derived from trade, and at least 50% of the profit or surplus is put back into the mission, and that those elements are embedded within constitutional governing documents. So that's the international definition. So if we're talking like Social Enterprise World Forum, that is their definition. It's 50% of income has to come from trade and 50% has to be put back into the mission, which means in effect, for a not-for-profit social enterprise, if it does derive 50% of income from trade, that's a social enterprise because it can't, the cash can't go anywhere else, right? The profit or surplus is constitutionally constrained and has to sit back in the not-for-profit organisation. If it's a for-profit social enterprise, then at least 50% of it is not distributed back to shareholders. So that's kind of the international, national, definitional stuff. But as I say, like, people exist on a spectrum. Not-for-profits obviously reinvest all of it. We have a lot of businesses who probably wouldn't call social enterprise, but just might be good ethical businesses that contribute some of their profit to the social mission. But they're not reinvesting that kind of level of profit or surplus into the mission. But I'll go through that in a little bit. Are there any questions? Oh, before we go to the next slide, I've popped back. There we go. Are there any definitions on the questions on the social enterprise definition? Okay.
I suppose I've got one comment or thought, and for me, I would be curious to know in our network or anybody in the room whether any of you are already deriving 50% of your income from trade. Because when I looked at the general definition, I think that describes quite a lot of our members already.
Yeah. Is anyone deriving 50% of income through trade?
So, yeah, because if we're gonna put the funding money in, so you know, like I'm around about 100,000 short of that, 94,000. So, are you saying if I'm now getting over the floor, like with my printing and room hire and everything like that, if I'm gonna get over 45,000, say, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that's great. I think what you've touched on is kind of the point here, and that's how do we define trade. And, you know, once again, contested definition. So generally, I think I have it in 2 slides' time, but organisations that have funding contracts, that generally wouldn't be considered trade. So that would be kind of a not-for-profit doing income-generating activities is kind of what that looks like in a definitional sense. But in a sense, sometimes the contracts can be trade, depending on if it's a kind of service that you're selling that can actually be bought or purchased by a number of different bodies, that could be defined as trade. So I think this this issue around what we define as trade as well as what we define as, you know, the social enterprise is also contested. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Can I just ask a question? With the different models or the different ways that we have received our funding, because before, well, now we're on in a tender process. So if we're tendering, aren't we tendering to supply a service? And isn't that, see, that's where, and if that changes again, it depends on how we are going to actually access our money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that idea of tendering or funding, like tendering versus grant, what's trade, what's not, like, and, you know, again, all contested, all up for, I guess, negotiation and debate. I probably lean more towards that being a not-for-profit generating income rather than it being a social enterprise. And that's only because if we start to subsume all of that underneath social enterprise, in a sense it loses the idea of having a meaning at all. And this is kind of, I haven't touched on it right now, and I think I do later, but this is what Jane talked about in terms of being socially enterprising versus having a social enterprise. Like, I think a lot of what we do is socially enterprising. Sorry, someone got a question? No, okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure. I think a lot of what we can do is socially enterprising, but maybe not social enterprise. But I think that's okay, because I think the system and probably people who profit off the idea of social enterprise and impact investment, being consultants and government, have often tried to make this a very sexy concept. And it is. Like, social enterprise and impact investment are a sexy concept. People want to do them. People want to fund them. But I think it's not the be-all and end-all, and it's not something that everyone can engage with. And so I think breaking the concepts down a little bit and trying to keep some integrity around that social enterprise concept rather than saying everything is social enterprise is really important to help the space develop a little bit more. Because it's all of this stuff we're talking about is still really emerging. In the next conversation that we were going to have, I will talk about some examples of what we have, and I have some examples towards the end of this slide deck as well. But we don't have a lot of examples here in WA of social enterprises. We had a social enterprise fund here in 2012, but it would only invest in, and I say invest because they were grants, so there was no innovation around how the financing was provided. And they would only provide to not-for-profit organisations, which is really important, but it completely ignores a whole subset of social enterprises that are for-profit in nature. So, yeah, and it didn't, you know, when we actually look at what came out of that fund, you've got probably 3 social enterprises that actually still exist. Befriend, which I think many of the members would be aware of. Dismantle, so Befriend is kind of a social inclusion focus. Even I would argue that they've moved away a little bit from the very traditional social enterprise sort of stuff, because they do kind of more service delivery in a broader sense now. Dismantle, which for those that may not know, work with bicycles. So they work with young people and basically help them to develop develop, what's the right word, put together?
Rebuild.
bicycles, yeah. And so, once again, there's a trade element, so people purchase that program, and, many different clients purchase that program, but in a sense it is still like a service delivery. And the third one, it's completely gone out of my brain.
Engaging young leaders on governance boards?
No.
The laundromat in Northcliffe.
Laundromat's a great example.
It was funded through that.
Oh, was it?
Yes.
Oh,
It was a social enterprise grant.
Well, that's a great example. So as a separate social enterprise, does it? So if I take that example, for example, the laundromat with Northcliffe, I imagine it's probably a not-for-profit or a for-profit structure, or it's just auspiced in a sense underneath Northcliffe.
I think it's just auspiced.
Just auspiced, yeah. But if you conceive of it as a separate entity, as a trading, all it does is trade, right? Effectively, that's trade. It might provide some support for people who can't afford to launder their clothes, but people purchasing, clothes laundering is effectively the entire purpose of its trade. So that's quite a good example. It's separate from the entity itself, right? So it's a social enterprise because it sits separately. So that's just an example of kind of these boundaries. They exist, and like you can see there are definitions that exist, but it's still, like, we could spend a day talking about what is social enterprise. That's how contested these things are. Any other questions about social enterprise definition? I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but that's okay. So now I'm going to talk about impact investment from the perspective that impact investment is one of the ways in which social enterprises get financing. So impact investment is this idea of investment that has the intention to generate actively measured social and environmental impacts alongside a financial return. So investors actually looking for some kind of measurable impact as well as a financial return. And the key thing is there is that financial return alongside this. So in this diagram, if we start with kind of the bottom right, so something that's high impact but low or no financial return would be philanthropy. So grants through Lottery West, there is no financial return to any kind of investor, but there is a high social impact in terms of what happens with grants and philanthropy. If we then go to the bottom left-hand corner, so low impact, low financial return. I don't know why we're interested in this, but actually a lot of us play in this area, right? So our term deposits, for example, pretty much create no social impact, but give a very low financial return compared to, potentially other investment possibilities. So then if we go up to the top left, traditional investments, so a high financial return but generally aren't making very much social impact. So I've got BHP shares there as an example. Most of the stuff that you would see on the ASX would be here, traditional investment, except there's one example, interestingly, Wide Open Agriculture, which is in the wheat belt, which have actually listed, so they're a publicly listed company, but they've embedded a full returns framework within what they're doing. So are kind of like a social enterprise listed on the stock exchange, which is a really interesting example, and I think pilot, because we don't often see that. Usually it's not a common thing to do. Do no harm, so DNH stands for do no harm. So sometimes these traditional investments might have a lens over the top of it called do no harm, which basically means they won't invest in things that are harming the planet or harming sort of social ecosystems. That can also be referred to as ethical investments, responsible investing. There's a whole bunch of different terms for it. But generally speaking, they're not intentional about the social impact they're creating. So they're thinking about it, they might be making sure they're not creating harm, but they're not actively thinking about and actively measuring the kind of impact that they're trying to see. So then we've got impact investment, which are these funders or financiers who are looking for social and financial return. There's a bit of debate in impact investment land about financial first and impact first investors. So some people think this is a useful dichotomy, it's a useful distinction to make. Some people say it's not really a distinction, and actually the best performing returns have a good level of social return and financial return. But just to explain those, so an impact first funder or impact first investor will be happy to compromise on financial return to know that they're creating a good social return and have a good measurable social return. So let's say hypothetically, and this is another very contested idea, but let's say market rate return is sitting at 5%, I don't know. Usually when we say market rate return, we're often talking about 6%, particularly with startups, but when we think about what kind of term deposit rates we're getting at the moment, we're at like 3% or something, aren't we?
If you're lucky.
Yeah, 3% if you're lucky, right. So what the market is and what the market rate return is also pretty contested, right? But having said that, let's hypothetically say that a market rate return might be 4%. An impact first investor would be happy to take, well maybe not happy, but would be fine with, tolerant of, a financial return of maybe 1 or 2% if they know that there's a strong social impact being achieved alongside in that investment. A financial first investor won't compromise on financial return, and so they will want a certain threshold financial return before investing. So that's the distinction between those two. As I say though, within the scene there's a little bit of debate about whether that's even a useful distinction, because some people believe that the best performing financial returns will be ones with the greatest impact. But I just, the evidence is out on that. I just don't think we've got enough investments occurring to be able to talk about whether that's true or not.
So could you give me an example of an organisation that would be an impact investor?
Yeah, it's really hard because, again, we don't have a lot of WA examples, right?
No.
But if I think about the eastern states, there's a few. So Impact Investment Group is a wealth management firm. They run a few different kinds of impact investments. A lot of their portfolio consists of like solar farms, so environmental investments. Generally, they're of a scale, so they're big enough that impact investors are interested. It's really, really difficult to be thinking about impact investment for small social enterprises. Usually what that would be a combination of grant and investment, like maybe a convertible note, which is this idea of if it could be a loan or it could be equity based on how well the business does. So we don't have a lot of examples I can use here. If, for example, if I use like a butchered example, right? If I say Lottery West decided that they were going to change their legislative framework, well, they wouldn't, Parliament would have to, but theoretically, if Lottery West did something where they would grant maybe $100,000 over 2 years to develop up an initiative, and then decided that they would provide a loan to that of $50,000 over a 5-year period, like quite a patient loan maybe, that would be an example of an impact investor, which is a blended finance example. So they've got the philanthropy in it, like as a bit of a seed funding, and then they've got the loan or maybe the equity on top of it. I realise I'm talking about debt and equity. They're the main forms of impact investment, but I never quite know what people's financial literacy is. So debt is obviously a loan, right? So they get their financial return through the interest rate. Equity is where you have investors that own part of the business. So for equity investment, it has to be a for-profit initiative. So yeah, it has to have the capacity to have owners. We as not-for-profit organisations have members. We don't have shareholders, which means we can't take on equity unless we have an interesting hybrid structure where we as a not-for-profit own a for-profit, and then we can invite other people to be investors in that separate for-profit entity. All of that is really context stuff. I think that when we look at impact investment in WA, we don't have a lot happening. We've been working really hard to have some things happening. We've received a little bit of advice that there may be an announcement in the budget around impact investment, and we've been working with the Treasurer's Office around what an announcement, a policy framework, an announcement would look like for impact investment in WA. But having said all of that, like it's quite early days in WA. The reason I talk about it with you in this context is just because impact investment is one of the key ways that social enterprises receive financing. Anyone got any questions or thoughts or reflections on the impact investment definitional stuff? Okay, and then I just thought I'd pick up on some of this language that we're seeing because of this increasing convergence of not-for-profit and for-profit. Because there's a lot of language out there, and sometimes I think, particularly when we talk to government folk, we can be conflating terms, and it's not really useful. So in terms of impact investment, we've talked about that definition. Have people heard of social impact bonds? No? So a bond, and again, I'm not saying I think that this is particularly relevant for you right now. It's just one of those things where it's useful being aware of the different concepts. But a social impact bond is this idea of you've got a really complex, thorny social issue, like often where we see bonds happening are in recidivism, homelessness, kids in out-of-home care. So it's something that's quite complex. Government and the sector, struggle to figure out exactly how to solve it, but it costs a lot to government. So that's what we have to have as a starting point. Complex issue, costs government a lot of money. The idea is that government, being the entity, the beast that it is not often putting up the capital initially to be able to solve these really quite complex social problems. So the idea is you can bring private investors in. So we figure out what the cost is to the state. So let's take out-of-home care as an example. What's the cost to the state of keeping a child in out-of-home care rather than with the family? Usually what we've seen is a large not-for-profit has a delivery, so an idea of a service offering that will kind of work on that problem. Investors come in to fund that. Once there's success, and all of the success sort of KPIs are fleshed out initially, once there is success, based on the return to government or the saving to government, government provides a return back to investors based on that initial investment. So out-of-home care and recidivism are two that we know it's really expensive for the state to, have prisoners in prison, but also to keep going back to prison rather than being in the community. And equally with out-of-home care, very expensive to keep kids in care rather than reunited with their families. So it's just two of the examples that we've seen. Again, WA doesn't have an example of this, but we have every other state in Australia has a pilot of social impact bond. Does that make sense? It's kind of complex, and usually I have a diagram to describe it. But they're the things you need. We've kind of seen people in the sector and government throwing around the idea of social impact bond all over the place, but not every service delivery idea or social issue is suitable for social impact bonds. So it's just, worth being aware of that. And social impact bond is just a form of pay for performance contracts. The idea is that there's success. We know what the success looks like. We're happy to pay based on success. And in a sense, pay for performance is a step along the way from where we're meant to be, which is outcomes-based contracting. So there's a spectrum here in terms of the contracting and engagement with government around these things. And yeah, we're at the very, very early stages. We don't have a lot of examples of these things working well. So social enterprise and business, we've talked a bit about that. Corporate social responsibility started shifting to this idea of shared or blended value. So we see a lot of businesses now thinking about how do we partner with the sector in a way that we're creating value for all, rather than I am a business, I have done well, I will contribute back because that is my social license to operate. That's my corporate social responsibility. It's moved a bit further from that to shared or blended value. Whether or not that's just a marketing piece or a different use of language and the intent is the same is totally up for debate. I'll go you through just a couple of these extra ones and then keep going. So benefit corporations and community interest corporations are actually different legal structures in the US and the UK for social enterprise. So they have this interesting legal prohibition, I guess, on distributing more than a certain amount to shareholders. So it's bedded into the legal structure rather than it being a thing that you have to write into your constitution. Again, we don't have that here. We have to choose one of the not-for-profit or for-profit legal structures available to us. But internationally, we can see some of the movement in terms of creating these new legal structures for social enterprise. B Corps are, they're kind of like an accreditation framework for businesses that are trying to do good. So only businesses can get B Corp certification, and they will effectively ask a whole bunch of very specific questions about your supply chain, about how you treat your employees, a whole bunch of other things. We're going through it at the moment for Impact Seed. It's very thorough. But effectively, it's this growing community of people who are thinking, well, how can we kind of demonstrate our intention to be good, ethical, responsible corporate citizens? So that's quite interesting. Conscious capitalism, let's skip that one. We can, if there's a question, we can come back to that. Venture philanthropy is philanthropy provided in a way that is quite like venture capital. So this is kind of very focused on the business development, what the business looks like, rather than just being about, oh, what social impact are we having? So it's just a different way of providing philanthropy that's quite popular with a lot of family offices and family foundations. And we've talked a bit about ethical investments. I just realised I could talk literally forever, so I just thought I'd skip through those a little bit and just see what else I've got here. Oh, good, and a picture. Great. Oh, right, okay, so I think this is useful in terms of, I'm just going to skip and make sure, okay, great. So just this one and then one more slide, and then I might just stop and we'll talk. Yeah. So in terms of the convergence of this not-for-profit and for-profit elements, and kind of what we were talking about before about social enterprise versus socially enterprising, this is just a sense of how you would, I guess, place these concepts along a spectrum, right? So you've got donor-dependent not-for-profit organisations. They're organisations that will probably never trade to fulfil mission, and nor do we want them to trade to fulfil mission. So either donor-dependent or dependent on government funding. And I guess the point I want to make about this whole spectrum is all of these are important. So it's not just that, oh, we need to be able to reframe as a social enterprise, or we need to be demonstrating, you know, value to fit into one of these other things. I think all of these are important, and it's incumbent on us as a sector, I guess, to be clear about what should be funded by government. And yeah, like where we could generate revenue and where maybe we shouldn't be so reliant on government funding. But it's more like a system needs to change. It's not just like we as not-for-profits need to shift. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's really important to acknowledge things that should be funded and be really clear about those things being funded. So you've got donor-dependent not-for-profits. You've got not-for-profits that undertake income generation activities, and I think a lot of what we do is probably there. Not-for-profit social enterprise or for-profit social enterprise. That's effectively, you know, trade to fulfill mission, all about before. But you could be either legal structure. So you could be a not-for-profit legal structure or a for-profit legal structure. Socially responsible business. So these are the businesses that are kind of doing that B Corp certification we talked about before. Beyond Bank's actually a B Corporation, but Ben & Jerry's, so those are like ice cream, also a B Corporation. So there's, you know, some of these businesses that are thinking about their impact, but aren't necessarily social enterprise. And then you've got traditional business, or I used to call it businesses that don't care, but then my husband thought that wasn't very palatable, so he changed my slides. So traditional business, which perhaps when we think about the Banking Royal Commission, that's, you know, there are some businesses that aren't particularly concerned about the impact they're having on their clients and customers. So maybe I think maybe on the spectrum, what I said before, that all of it's important, maybe we want all businesses to think about actually the impact they do have on their clients at a minimum, if they're not thinking about their community, just the impact for clients. But yeah, there is a spectrum, and generally we've seen businesses coming further into the middle and not-for-profits coming further into the middle. Yeah. Are there any questions on that? There's just one more slide I want to talk about. Any questions on that convergence, that spectrum stuff? For me, it just helps contextualize a lot of these concepts into this sort of spectrum. I like spectrums. I know things aren't always linear, and nor should they be. But you know, in my mind, I quite like spectrums, boxes, matrices. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the impact models. So there's a lot of different ways that a social enterprise can create impact. And a lot of enterprises will be doing more than one of these kinds of models, but I just wanted to highlight them. And this also just gives an opportunity for me to talk a bit about the kinds of models that we have that exist. And noting, first of all, that most social enterprises will be more than one kind, right? So the first one is the better the business does, the higher the impact it has. So higher up is an Eastern States social enterprise. They're looking at effectively a bit of an NDIS matching scheme. So matching people who have budgets to people who can do the work that they might be looking for under their NDIS budget. So the better that business does, so the more clients they have, the more carers, the more profit it's generating, the higher the impact that it has. The second one is impact is built into the operating model. So Street is a social enterprise from Victoria. They work with young people with an experience of homelessness, have them working in cafes, creating coffee, catering. They get the certificates in sort of barista training and catering, and then they can go on to find further work. So in that sense, they're the people they're working with, their clients, consumers, whatever word we want to use, are actually built into the operating model through employment, right? Third is impact created through the supply chain. So Edico is a social enterprise that looks at creating kind of like sporting apparel, soccer balls, things like that. But it's more fair trade oriented. So they're very clear about where all the materials come from, who's creating the products, and how well they're being paid. So that's very much about that supply chain, right? Profit share, so who gives a crap? Is anyone using who gives a crap? Might be hard in the we do, yeah. So who gives a crap is toilet paper. So they basically for what they, in addition to thinking about their products and how the supply chain and the employment, they also are distributing a profit. So an amount of the profit that they create, they share that with sort of the entities in developing countries that are looking at sanitation and hygiene and stuff like that. And then fifthly is equity share or full ownership. So this is where a not-for-profit organisation owns a business and effectively they have a revenue stream through owning that business. I think that's an interesting fifth one to add, because in effect then what you could be saying is that a not-for-profit could own a business that's completely unrelated to anything that they're kind of doing as the core work, but it is a social enterprise by virtue of the fact that it's generating revenue for that not-for-profit organisation. So I think, again, that could be debated, right? I think, though, there's something about the mission of the not-for-profit, therefore, and what you wouldn't be aligning probably with a business that's doing completely terrible, awful things in your community. So, you know, I think that's where the check and balance would be in terms of the impact in the business, would be in the mission of the not-for-profit. But it's just interesting to think about that as another of the impact models. Does anyone have questions or thoughts on any of those? Okay, so I think I'll leave it there, and then yeah, if there's questions or if you want to discuss more.
Yeah. So, does anybody have any sort of general thoughts or general questions? I've got lots. But I want to hand it over to you first.
Yeah. I'd like to see or hear about examples of how this really relates to the CRC. So far, the only example I've heard about is the laundromat that you talked about. So I'd just like to bring it down, you know, a few rungs to a lower, more grassroots level of, you know, ideas we could directly relate to.
Yeah, totally. I think that's an interesting question. So I've thought about it a lot. There's some examples. So the reason why we kind of tried to divide that into a separate conversation was because there's so much content. Like, we could be talking forever, right? And some of the foundational concepts are really useful. So in terms of how does this operate in place, we were thinking of talking about that in a future conversation, which we still will. But I think for me, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think I've been saying to Jane for a while, like, I really think this can be relevant for CRCs. I'm just not quite sure exactly what it is yet. And I think particularly around impact investment and potentially looking at scale, I think there's something there. But yeah, I'm not saying I've got all of the answers, right? I know that we've got some examples, interesting examples in the eastern states. So I don't know if any of you have heard of Tender Funerals, but this is operated by a neighbourhood centre in Queensland, I think. But Tender Funerals is basically looking, so in the community they didn't have any other options or possibilities for looking at not just culturally appropriate funerals, but I guess funerals at all. So it's a neighbourhood centre that set up a separate social enterprise that looks at providing that service, which I think is a really interesting example. I do understand that we've got some issues around our contracts and what we can actually do in communities in terms of competing with local business. But I think that segues really well with a session that we want to do at conference around bridging this economic and community divide. So we've had a presentation recently by an economist who was talking about, in place, what does economic development look like? And I think there's a really interesting role that we can play as centres in our communities in bridging that and finding the things that aren't competing with local businesses but that need to happen, and either filling that gap or bringing people in to fill that gap. So a bit of a fulcrum point rather than actually being actually deciding what we're going to run and then just running it in isolation. So I guess the short answer to that question is, we don't have a lot of examples. I think that a lot of the activity that centres are already doing is socially enterprising, and some of them are social enterprises. But it's probably a matter of, okay, well, let's surface all of that collective knowledge that we already have across the network and think about what's the next step, like with this knowledge and understanding, and what's the next step? Yeah.
Yeah, and I was almost thinking, wary about mentioning the word survey, because I know that you're all surveyed to death, but it would be really interesting to ask all of our network neighbourhood centres and CRCs what activities they're undertaking at the moment that do generate them a good income, that are successful. So I've noticed increasingly more coffee shops being run now by CRCs, and I'm assuming that those are in places, they're like Wellstead and Franklin River, where they presumably don't have a coffee shop, so they're not competing with a local business. And in fact, I know Wellstead, they set theirs up because the local coffee shop closed down. Northcliffe Family Centre runs a laundromat. I know York CRC and quite a few of the neighbourhood centres are now offering catering services. In Manjimup Family Centre, not Manjimup Family Centre, Manjimup CRC, they actually got a social enterprise grant to set up an employment agency. So Forest Personnel, run out of Manjimup, is run by the CRC, and that is an employment service. And Nui has said that when she looked into it, because they've done all the hard work, it would probably be an investment of, at the time, she said about $10,000 for another centre to invest in the platform to then potentially run their own employment service. We've got a neighbourhood centre in Perth now that have just, with Lottery West money, developed a commercial kitchen. They have a very multicultural community, and they're going to be providing catering, etc. there. So it would be really interesting, actually, to just put the word out and ask. You know, I know CRCs, a lot of you, for example, provide the local newspaper. Now, does that advertising that you generate with the local newspaper just cover the cost of the paper, or do you generate enough income from that to be reinvested back into the CRC and the community? So, and I'd be curious to know if any of you have got any particular activities that you're running. Yes, Petra.
Well, I'm just talking with the Shire whether that we should actually set up a weekly or fortnightly fresh fruit market, because that's not happening in Denmark currently, funny enough. But it came out in the strategic plan that the community wants that. So we all have got all the examples you just said. People needed to have some money at the beginning to be able to do it. So the question, I like your idea to sort of harvest all the projects, what other centres do that actually make them some money. As I said, like our room booking, but it is a facility you need to build. Like we're lucky enough to have been given it. But and then we also have the community garden started, so we haven't really anything we can sell yet. But I think with the fresh fruit market, would there be somewhere some kind of funding money out there, or where would you start to look for this, and would that fit into the model?
I think that's a good example. So in the eastern states, there's been quite a few food hubs come up. And I actually, when I first heard of food hubs, I thought, oh wow, like I think centres would be such an excellent example of them. So they're kind of like what you're talking about around having a fresh food market, but it's a bit more than that. It's kind of like how are we connecting our farmers with the community. Like there's a deeper level of intent, I guess, around the social mission of these. So I think where they were funded in the eastern states, and this is where it's a struggle for WA, right? I'm not going to lie, because they have a lot of family foundations in the eastern states who've done a lot of the pioneering work around this sort of space. We have been talking to Lottery West. I think we might get them there eventually about thinking about, some of these kind of pilot projects, but they're very much like, we cannot engage with anything that looks like it's going to create revenue because, there's competition things involved.
Oh, so Lottery West wouldn't provide seed funding for a social enterprise?
No, but
they wouldn't.
If you call it a social enterprise, no.
Ah, okay.
If you say it's a pilot project of something, then yes. And this is, this is the shame, because it's hard for us to further our sophistication around the definitions in this area if we can't actually call it what it is, and we have to find ways to get the money in different ways. So I do think Lottery West would be interested in food hubs, because it is also possible that it, so we're talking social enterprise and impact investment, right? And I'm just going to be very honest with you. These are forms of us trying to cannibalize capitalism to bring people who do terrible things further along this spectrum of, hey, maybe let's do less terrible things to the planet and to the people, right? In a sense, we don't even want to be talking about this. We want to be talking about cooperatives, like locally managed and run organisations, communities doing things within their community, These concepts of impact investment and social enterprise, whilst useful in many respects, are also still capitalist concepts, right? A food hub example, they use collective impact principles, and they've been doing some really interesting work. I'll find the example. I think it's not Logan. I'll find the example and send it so that when we distribute this, we can do it. But yeah, they worked with family foundations, and we don't have a lot of them. I think Lottery West is probably the one example where you could go to get that kind of funding. Yeah.
I had a meeting with a consultancy that specialise in connecting not-for-profits with philanthropists and foundations earlier this week, and anyway, that's an early conversation, but that's part of our sort of area of interest, is looking at how can we connect at Link West and the network in with a foundation or a philanthropist, etc. I had another thought. So there's also a couple of eastern states neighbourhood centres that run building maintenance services, local building maintenance services, and I met yesterday the CEO of Essential Personnel, which is a disability service provider in the Wheat Belt, and they have a building maintenance social enterprise, and majority of their staff are their clientele as well, so people with disabilities. So that would be another example. Yeah, but I think if there's an appetite for it, we could potentially develop up a survey to find out what socially enterprising activities our network are already doing that are successful.
Yeah. But part of it is also the investment you've got to make to do it. Like some things create a good surplus, some don't, and it's important to know how much effort you've got to put into something to know what kind of surplus or profit we're creating. Yeah. And some of those are very hidden costs that I think Jane gave an example once of the photocopying in one of the centres and just charging a little bit more to cover that, there's staff time involved in, hi, how are you? Yes, we can help you do that photocopying or whatever it is, right? So I think there's certain costs, and so there will be certain numbers of these initiatives which are better for us in terms of generating surplus. So how can we be clear about what those are as compared to the ones that do require, like in the startup scene, cafes are notoriously difficult to run. Generally, investors don't look well on cafes because they have such a high overhead to get them operating. So yeah, I think being able to, if we did have a landscape check-in, like looking at what actually exists, and then putting some consistent language or common understanding around the surplus required, the surplus that can be created and the overhead required, that would be really useful. And I think then we could see what's already happening and where could we go from there.
Yeah. Give ideas in terms of what different CRCs can do. Because going back to the point about that you made, Petra, about you're not allowed to compete against local businesses, I'm assuming that Wellstead and Franklin River, and there's at least one other CRC that's running a cafe, it's because there isn't another cafe that they're competing against. The Northcliffe Family Centre laundromat, it's because there wasn't a laundromat in the town that they identified a gap.
I think that's what we all, I'm for years trying to figure out where the gap is and where you can fit in particular in the size of Denmark, like it's a little bit a bigger town with more services already there. So it's that's a challenge, and so I'm more than thankful to the Shire that we have got this big building which we can actually hire out and get an income from it. But the other thing I wanted to say, Jane, is that the Albany Hospice is running an upcycle, recycle shop. So actually, that's actually also a very interesting model. If you have got people in town who are quite clever in upcycling stuff and creating stuff, and so they run op shops. Op shops can be often, I mean, here in Denmark, op shops are run by the churches, so but I think in other towns that could maybe also work for smaller towns to run an op shop. And then the hospice in Albany does run the op shop with this recycle shop attached to it, and it's also an interesting concept. But then again, I do have an op shop in town, and I have a little bit an upcycle one in town. So it wouldn't work for us. Yeah.
So a lot of the regional neighbourhood centres run op shops. I don't know how much money they make from them, but they do. Tom Price, a lot of the, in fact, even some of the metro ones. Even though there's Vinnie's and some of the bigger outlets not too far away run op shops. A lot of our centres now are doing what are they called, repair cafes and upcycling as well. And just to direct you to an email we sent out just recently about the container deposit scheme. So we have been working in partnership with an organisation that is tendering for that contract, with the idea that our network can benefit in terms of being a recycling point, not a recycling point, a collection point, so that your community and hopefully your centre can benefit. It really depends who that contract is awarded to, but I would strongly recommend that you go online and register your interest as an organisation to make sure that you're kept in the loop. That way we can also see which of you are interested. So depending on the outcome of the tender, we can get back to you as quickly as possible and continue the conversation around being a recycling point, not a recycling collection point. I'm really conscious of the time. Jo's pointing to her hand. John, I know we didn't touch on your issue about the impact of if you generate more income, the effect it might have in terms of your needing to be a different tier of the Associations and Corporations Act, which is a fact, absolutely. Perhaps we can carry on that conversation a bit later. So we've got 2 more conversations to go. We haven't fixed the dates yet, and based on the feedback from today, those will be adapted and modified depending on what you want. And also Kylie will be running 2 masterclasses, so 2 one-hour sessions at the conference on the 16th, 17th and 18th of October. Plug. And the travel and accommodation subsidies are out there, so if you want to get those in as quickly as possible, and the program and registrations will be opening hopefully next month sometime, to give people plenty of time to come to that. Was there anything else that anybody wanted to say before I wrap up? Kylie? No?
I think just that, some of this introduction. Sorry, you go.
Will you send me that Food Hub information through?
Yes.
Okay.
Alphington is the name of it, but yes, I will send it through. Yeah.
All right, so I think we always send out a questionnaire, a survey, and a questionnaire anyway. So any feedback in terms of more, what you would like for future sessions to focus on, and just the overall feedback. And I think that's it.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Kylie. Thanks for being here. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning.
Bye.
Bye.